So welcome to the MADIA Wavemaker meetup for Wavemaker 360 Health. Just a brief introduction of MADIA. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We our mission is to ensure the technical, scientific, and industrial workforce are connected by having programs such as this on entrepreneurship, business finance and operations, and development and commercialization of technology, all in settings which bring people together to collaborate. And I see we have someone to admit. So with that, I will introduce our presenter, who is Jay Goss. He is the general manager of Wavemaker 360 Health. Before becoming a venture capitalist, Jay helped bring companies, a lot of them to life, by building and running early stage businesses from 0 to 5 years old, mostly in healthcare, often in healthcare, working entrepreneurially, as well as entrepreneurially for bigger companies such as Disney, Reed, Elsevier, and Summa Group, and UCLA, building business units within those companies. They were entrepreneurial. Long story short, Jay knows the entrepreneurial journey pretty well. Each one's a little different, but he learns something new every time. He's done about 30 startups. Wavemaker 360, and he'll get into this a little bit more, but it is an early stage health tech venture headquartered in Pasadena. The fund focuses on healthcare startups from seed to Series A investments. They have invested in about 60 companies, or 60 plus companies over the past 6 years, first launching their fund in 2018. Distinguishing Wavemakers 360 is 300 plus limited partners who have experience as healthcare organizations themselves or as individuals in the healthcare business. So they have an unfair advantage with deal flow and diligence capabilities and helping companies succeed once they get funded. Some of the fund's breakout successes have been Citizen from the Bay Area, Iterative Health from Boston, Skin Analytics from London, Gradient from North Carolina, Triple Blind from Kansas City, and in Southern California, Regard, Ready Set Food, Cameo Mobility, and Carlsbad. That's just to name a few. So with that, welcome, Jay. This for the online people.
All right. Well, it's good to see you, everybody. Thank you, Bruce. I'm with Wavemaker 360 Health. We are a venture capital fund, so we'll go into that a little bit more. I've learned that venture capital funds kind of mean different things to different people, so we'll demystify that a little bit if that needs demystification. We're in Pasadena, so just a little bit west of here. As Bruce mentioned, we started our venture fund in 2018. Really started it in 2017. We started finding companies to invest into in 2018, open up the bank account, and Bruce is right. We've invested in a little bit over 60 startups along the way. The title of the talk today had something about the inside baseball of venture capital. So I'm going to try to do a lot of inside baseball because whenever I was on the other side as running all these different startups, I always really wanted to know how venture capitalists think. And I found that they rarely tell you how they think. And it's really, if you have a startup and you're trying to raise capital, it would be really helpful to understand how the money is thinking about things. If you go, I don't know, you go get a home loan or a car loan, you know exactly what their criteria is. It's very transparent. Venture capital is almost the opposite, very opaque, hard to know how venture funds are thinking about the startup world. I can't answer all questions about all sources of funding, but we have a good idea of how venture capital and venture capital funds deploy capital into startups. We'll talk mostly about healthcare because that's where my knowledge starts and ends with respect to Wavemaker. but there's people on Zoom, and I know there's people in this room that can keep me honest. We work a lot with the Pasadena Angels. We work a lot with City of Hope. We work a lot with Caltech. We might be working a lot with VendRx, just to name a few. And so as we go, if there are things, we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions, but if you guys want to jump in with questions, if I'm not getting to enough of the inside baseball, since that's my number one objective, stop me and we'll do some inside baseball Q&A on the fly. Our fund, just to give you kind of what's inbounds and out of bounds for our fund in terms of what we invest in, which could then inform the rest of the conversation. We're a healthcare fund and we have a pretty crazy, generous definition of what it means to be a healthcare company. If you went all the way down from company 1 to 65 on our portfolio page, you'd be almost confused because we've got medical device companies and we've got companies that are doing the FDA thing and they maybe are technically medical device companies, but boy, you wouldn't necessarily think of them stereotypically as medical device. We have digital health companies, we have healthcare technology companies, we have science companies. We're pretty eclectic. It's all going to be healthcare. You're not going to find our fund investing in electric scooters or Snapchat or all that other kind of silly stuff that goes on in West LA. We kind of stay in our lane. We were built for healthcare. We were built to fund healthcare startups. In fact, if we were doing this talk in 2017 or 2018, we would have started with really our origin story. What problem, we often tell entrepreneurs, talk to us about the problem you're trying to solve and then talk to us about how you're solving. That's a really, like, if you're starting a company, if you're going to raise capital now or down the road, funders and investors love to sort of get to understand the problem you're solving and then how you're solving it, because that's common vocabulary no matter what your startup is. One of the problems that we wanted to solve when we started Waymaker 360 Health was there was very little capital in Los Angeles, Southern California. If you think about, if you've been here long enough, we had almost no venture capital 30 years ago. You had to go to Burbank, you had to fly up to Northern California to raise capital from venture. And then venture funds started to pop up a little bit here and there, but almost never did they have the courage to invest in healthcare stuff. They were running around investing in electric scooters and Snapchat. And as an entrepreneur, that frustrated me. I would run various healthcare startups, and I had to go to Burbank Airport and fly up to Silicon Valley or San Francisco to raise capital, or Boston, because gosh darn it, second largest city in America with all this healthcare entrepreneurship, didn't really have a venture fund that was willing and able to invest into healthcare startups. Few exceptions, but generally not. So my partner and I sort of raised our hand and said, we can solve that. This little city of ours deserves to have at least one venture fund. And this goes back to 2017. We don't really tell the story this way so much anymore, but we said to ourselves, we got to have one shop that's really dedicated to the serious stuff, the stuff that really is making an impact on the world. We don't call ourselves an impact fund, but the kind of stuff that we invest in is making life better for patients, extending life, quality of life, making life better for nurses and doctors and allied healthcare professionals, driving costs down, making it easier to provide access to communities in rural parts of the country, and on and on and on. It seems like a good thing to do. So we stood up a fund in 2017 and 2018. We got some Pasadena Angels together. We got some Tech Coast Angels together. We got some other high net worth individuals from around the country. We opened up a bank account and we started investing in companies here in California, of course, because we had our own backyard, especially Southern California. Kind of started to move east, invested in companies. Well, we moved all the way east, invested in companies on the East Coast, and then started to invest in companies in the Midwest. Today, we have companies primarily in North America, primarily in the United States within North America, a couple in Canada, a smattering in Western Europe, and a little presence in Asia. But that's what we do. It's all healthcare. And hopefully we've made a difference by having at least one venture fund. You know, there's a few thousand of us up in the Bay Area between Silicon Valley and Palo Alto. And there's a few dozen here in Los Angeles, but again, most of them are not doing healthcare. So we wanted to raise our hand and say, if you're doing something healthcare related, maybe you should come talk to us about capital. Bruce also mentioned where we invest stage wise. So most of what I'll be incredibly able to talk to you about is the earlier stage of the startup spectrum. We're typically coming in after the angels, whether it's a formal angel group like the Tech Coast Angels or the Pasadena Angels, or an individual angel. We're usually the first money in that's professional. So the companies typically get off the ground with founder self-financing the business for a little while. That might be for 5 minutes, that might be for 5 years, then maybe some friends and family money, some angel money, maybe some non-dilutive capital. And then the professional money comes in. We come in usually as one of the first venture funds who invest into the startup. And at some point they exceed our financial capacity and they need to raise tens of millions of dollars to go from maybe second base to third base. And then they go up to the Silicon Valley or Boston, most typically to raise the big bucks. We're going to typically put anywhere from $250,000 into a company up to $2 or $3 million into a company. But what we can't do is write a $20 or $30 million check into a company. So at that point, hopefully the company is far enough along, they've been de-risked, and then they can go to the giant venture funds that have $1 billion in their bank account or a few $1 billion in their bank account. And they can write 25, 35, 50, $100 million checks. That's not the sport that we play. Probably the thing I like to talk about most when it comes to our fund, I mentioned we started it because really supply and demand. There was demand for venture capital that was healthcare focused. In Southern California, there was not a lot of supply, so we started a venture fund. The other thing we did, which is just the really zooming out for a minute, the other reason we started is we're just convinced that this is probably a good time for healthcare entrepreneurship. VendRx is probably going to do better today than it would have done. Well, I guess you couldn't have had your technology 30 or 40 years ago, but let's say you could. The population wasn't as attractive for a product like that. Today, 11,000 people turn 65. You know, a couple of years ago, we were reading in USA Today that 10,000 people were turning 65 every day. Today, it's 11,000. We're still creeping up that bell-shaped curve that came out of the World War II and the baby boomers. And it's not to say you can't consume healthcare. People can go to City of Hope if they're 25. I could sprain my ankle at 54. But we become bigger customers. If you just want to think about it as who's the customer, we become bigger customers in healthcare at or around the time we turn 65, because that's at or around the time the body starts to break down. And we have 11,000 more. The healthcare industry has 11,000 more customers every day now, if you sort of think about that macro picture. So more demand for healthcare than ever before, more demand for a vending machine that can dispense medication at the urgent care clinic than there would have been 10 years ago. And most people accept that. And I think that that part of our supply and demand story is well understood. I think 60 Minutes and CNN and People Magazine, they've been covering this. The baby boomers are retiring for a long, long time. We kind of accept this. When we started the fund, 1 in 8 Americans was a senior. Today, 1 in 6 Americans is a senior. 2 years after the LA Olympics in 2028, 1 in 4 Americans is a senior. So country's getting old. We have more seniors in diapers in the United States than we have babies in diapers. Country's getting old. So it's a good time to be trying to innovate in healthcare because there's more demand, but there's also less supply. Because when those 11,000 people turn 65 today, what is the other thing, at least in the United States, that happens when you turn 65? You're done. You retire. That's the thing we do in this country at 65. And since the healthcare industry is primarily a service-based industry, we're losing, of those 11,000 people that turn 65 today, 3,215 of them are in the healthcare industry, one way or another. And they just retired today. So the very time we need more, just think about if you're running the United States healthcare system, I guess somebody in Washington DC is running the United States healthcare system. You've got a supply and demand problem. We need more labor to take care of a greater supply of people that need healthcare services, but we have less labor because they're retiring. So it seems to me one of the easiest ways to solve this problem, but certainly not easy, but of the solutions, we need more healthcare technology because we have to make the remaining workforce more productive. The nurses have to be more productive, the doctors have to be more productive, the allied healthcare professionals, which are the nutritionists, the dietitians, the chiropractors, the physical therapists, everybody has to be more productive, or else this whole thing's going to fall on its face. And we're excited about that because the common denominator, the kind of companies that we invest in generally are solving problems that, even though they don't talk about it this way, they are making the United States healthcare industry more productive, more labor efficient. Things that happened in all these other industries a long time ago. At City of Hope, I think we learned you guys have, I think 420 people that have pagers on their belt right now. Who else has pagers, right? The healthcare industry is a little bit behind. The healthcare industry is keeping the fax business, the fax machine business alive. Like there's a lot of low hanging fruit in healthcare. We're basically investing in companies that aren't necessarily super futuristic. They're just solving problems for the healthcare industry that other industries solved a really long time ago. It's just the healthcare industry didn't sort of skipped a couple decades and hasn't implemented as much technology, minus the science work. A lot of great science gets done, whether it's biotech or medical device. A lot of good science work has been done, but a lot of the rest of the healthcare industry is really ripe for innovation. And that's the kind of stuff that we invest in. Let me jump in here, get you guys off the one slide that you've been looking at too long. So where we are from an evolution standpoint, I mentioned we started in 2018. That's a little faint, but the left-hand box is where we started in 2018. The middle box is the fund that we are just wrapping up. And what that means is we raised capital from 84 investors in 2018. We put the money, this is where I'll demystify how venture capital works. For generally speaking, that means I went out and found 84 people. They put a bunch of money into a bank account. And then my job was to hire a team that hopefully professionally takes that lot of money. In this case, it was the first fund was 25 million. And we invested in the 34 companies out of the 32 companies out of that with that 25 million. So some companies got a few hundred thousand, some companies got a few million, but we got 32 companies out of the garage, so to speak, or out of the basement. Some of them went on to become wild successes. Some of them went on to become crash and burns, but that's what we do. We take a lot of risk, invest in these companies earlier. Maybe we're like Shark Tank for healthcare, but we're Shark Tank for healthcare, but without a television show. And then a couple of years later, we launched our second fund, a little bit bigger. That fund was 75 million. It's just wrapping up. It will have invested in about 35 of the same kind of healthcare startups. And then next month, we open up the third bank account. That bank account will be about $100 million, and that will invest in about 40 startups. And that's just what we do all day long. It goes in 2 or 3 or 4 year cycles because we start the bank account over each time. But our job is to find those really interesting healthcare companies. That one of the phrases we use is, put a dent in the healthcare universe. We're looking for companies that can start out as zero revenue, relatively low value companies. And then someday they're the next NVIDIA, someday they're the next Uber, someday they're the next giant healthcare company. And that's how our investors make their money back, is some percentage of those 32 companies or 35 companies or 40 companies go on to do really great things. They either become a publicly traded company, or they get acquired by a Microsoft, or they get acquired by a McKesson or a United Health Group or a Johnson & Johnson. All these famous companies in America tend to do less and less innovation. And what they do is they go and they have teams of people all around the country that are paying attention to the startups that we invest in. And they say, oh, to use a local company that Bruce mentioned, we invested into Ready Set Food, which developed a technology. This technology is a powder that gets added to formula or breast milk for the baby, all but ensuring that the child does not develop a food allergy. We want that company to grow up from being a little tiny baby company, no pun intended, to being a great big company so that Johnson and Johnson or somebody that's in the healthcare baby formula business gobbles them up and buys that company for several hundred million or several $billion. And then our investors have a really nice payday because when we bought the company, it was worth 5 million or 10 million. And then if we sell it for $1 billion, that's a really good profit margin for our investors. And it has to be, and this is a little of the inside baseball, it has to be because we make a ton of bad bets. If we're out there in fund one, we place 32 bets on 32 companies. A whole bunch of them are going to crash and burn when all is said and done. So the inside baseball here for you guys to appreciate is, yeah, we're going to have a few companies where we're going to make 100 times our money, but that a lot of the 100 times our money had to pay for some of the stupid bets that we ended up making where the companies did not work out and they ended up going to zero. So that's the financial math. That's the math of how these venture funds work. Basically, like if any of you do angel investing, very similar to an angel, we just make a lot of bets and we do it for a living. We have give you a sense of who the we is on this. We have an 8-person investment team made up of people that do ex-FDA, so they understand how the FDA thinks about startups, which is a really tricky and opaque thing. We have clinicians, we have people that ran some of the biggest health systems in America. The guy that I started the fund with was the head of Ernst & Young's entire global healthcare practice, multi-billion-dollar practice. And then went to, I didn't hear anybody say they were from the insurance industry, so I will say John Knackle, who I started our fund with, then is fond of saying he then went to the dark side, which of course means he went to work for an insurance company, and he went to work for the biggest one, meaning United Health Group, and he ran Optum for United Health Group as it was becoming Optum. But this is where we're a little different from an angel. An angel is, investing their own money, and they're kind of looking at their own deals. They might be investing in their next door neighbor. They might be part of the Pasadena Angels. So they're looking at a certain amount of investable companies, but they're not a formal company organized to make investments. Our team here, we just did the analysis for 2022 and 2023, and we invested in one company for every 75 that we evaluated. So extremely picky. I'm basically that means we're taking 75 meetings with 75 startups, and 74 of them we wish we hadn't taken. One we ended up writing a check into. Yeah.
Sorry, just going back to the previous slide, I didn't want to interrupt you, but you had a thing where it says initial ownership target 1 to 3%, and then 4 to 10%. I'm guessing 10 to.
Oh, yeah, you can't see that.
As someone who's not in the business, I wonder what that being referred to.
So I'll relate it to Shark Tank. I don't know, that's the best way to make the analysis. But we're going to put, let's say, we just invested into a Caltech spin-out. It was a company that developed over many years inside Caltech. They developed some they would kill me for saying this, some very fancy ultrasound technology that when applied to the outside of the body on the arm can continuously monitor your blood pressure. It's a really interesting proposition because blood pressure is one of those really important things that we don't do very well as a species. We can take you a point in time measurement of your blood pressure. We can invasively measure your blood pressure, but if you want continuous blood pressure and you want it to be non-invasive, that's trouble. We wrote $1 million check into this company. So if the company says we're a $10 million company, then that means I own 10% of the company. If the company says, Jay, I really think we're a $100 million company, well, I would say, no, you're not. But let's say I agreed with it. then I own 1% of the company. So my percent ownership matters because I'm playing the sport of invest in the company at time zero, wait 3 to 6 or 7 years, hopefully, and then the company is worth hundreds of millions, maybe billions of dollars. So my starting ownership percentage matters quite a bit because when the company, let's say this blood pressure company out of Caltech, let's say we invested at 10 million, what's called a $10 million valuation. So we own 10% of it because we put 1 million in. If they sell for $100 million, then I get 10% of that 100 million. But if I only started with 2%, I'm only getting 2% of that 100 million.
So why is it going up with each iteration?
Because we got more courage, really is the true answer. We raised 25 million, then 75 million, and soon to be 100 million from our investors. So we raised significantly more money, but you can see the number of companies that we invested in didn't go up proportionally. We went from 32 to 35 to 40. Reason being, we wanted to put more money into each company, thereby getting a larger equity stake and having a little bit more control over the company. The math works out more in our favor. And now that I look back and I said, when we were just starting out, our hand would shake when we wrote a $100,000 check because that was a lot of money. And then we started writing $250,000 checks and $500,000 checks. And a few months ago, we wrote a $2 million check. The honest answer, more inside baseball, is the longer you do this, the more the confidence you have to write bigger checks.
And that you want a greater stake.
And
own a bigger stake of the company.
There's probably co-investors too, so the total amount of outside funding could be much higher than your stake.
For us, it's 100% true. There are venture funds that'll fall in love with Vendor X who might be wanting to raise $5 million. And thank you for being here because I can use you as a case study each time. And say, I so love this company, here's a $5 million check. We won't ever do that. We will always take a little extra time and put together a group of investors. We think we're hot stuff, but we're also smart enough to know that, well, I'll use Ready Set Food as an example. When we invested in Ready Set Food to do the food allergy prevention, how great it would be if we had no more egg allergy, milk allergy, nut allergy with babies and then adults, all thanks to sprinkling a little powder in breast milk or baby formula when the kid is 3 months old. It's a pretty good thing. That investment was made by us, a health system that we all know, Providence, a little company we all know, Johnson & Johnson. Mark Cuban from Shark Tank invested in that company. So we put 8 or 9 important investors all together. And that company has raised about $20 million over the last few years including another investor is Danone, one of the largest food companies in America that happens to have a clean product called baby formula. You can see where their interest in this company might be somewhere down the road as Ready Set Food gets a little bit bigger. But that's very indicative of how we like to invest because we like our money to go into the company, but we'd also like other people's money to go into the company, especially if those other people have deep pockets or they're strategically valuable. Johnson & Johnson's way more strategically valuable to Ready Set Food than we are. And so is Danone, and so is Providence. And that's great for us because our money is more secure when other investors come into the startup at the same time we do.
Yeah. A quick follow-up on that. Did you put this group of people together? Mark Cuban, John.
I'm not taking credit for Mark Cuban for sure, because they got on Shark Tank. And that had nothing to do with us. Yeah, that made us look good because we invested in them. Then they got on Shark Tank.
So you were the people where they say two other investors reveal and they go, oh.
That's right. Yeah, exactly right. No, we're influential. Sometimes we actually flat out bring another investor or two to the company. We just invest in a company that's doing wireless surgical navigation. We brought investors to the table for them to meet with. It also depends a little bit on the capabilities of the founder. there are some founders, if they're running around the Silicon Valley, they can raise millions of dollars by going to the right coffee shops in Silicon Valley, because that's where the epicenter of venture capital is. And then we invest in a founder that might be in North Carolina, might be in Kansas City, and maybe they don't have as much access to venture capital. We might have to work a little bit harder to help them find 2 or 3 other venture funds to round out a $5 million round or a $3 million round or a $10 million round.
So you'd be like Shark Tank, and you'd only put your $1 million in.
We actually always will do that. Yeah, we'll always compel the startup, because the worst thing we could do is put our million in. Let's say the company really needed $5 million to finish the technology, get a clinical trial going, and then get a rubber stamp from the FDA 18 months later. If that costs $5 million and we put $1 million in and they don't do the other four, and they don't get the other 4 million, our million's done, right? That's a risk that's a bad risk to take. There's a million other things that can go wrong with the company. That's one that I can control. So we will not, and more, this isn't unique to Wavemaker, we will generally not invest into a company until enough capital comes in to get the company from maybe proverbial first base to proverbial second base, or proverbial second base to proverbial third base.
With each of the investments that you're making into a company, do you have a different mix of people, or is do your investors throw the money in the pot and then somebody else decides how it's all going to get spent, and they get something back from their percentage of the
I think what you're describing, yeah, and from a vocabulary standpoint, what you're describing is a pledge fund versus a regular venture capital fund. We are a regular venture capital fund. So we have, in this case, the $75 million in our bank account. The investors sign a piece of paper, say, Jay and the other 7 people on the team, go ahead and spend 3 years, try to find us 35 companies. We don't go back to them for each single investment. They don't have any sign off. They don't decide which companies they want to put money into and which companies they don't. A pledge fund, which don't quote me on this, but maybe 5%, 10% of funds are pledge funds. Then in that case, and this is important to know if you're an entrepreneur, because another place the venture capital industry could probably use a little bit of transparency kick in the butt is they rarely will say that. But if I was a pledge fund, then I would fall in love with vendor X. I would commit to $1 million investment. And then I'd have to run around to my investors and say, hey, who wants to contribute to this $1 million investment that I want to make? And that takes extra time. And then that puts the founder, the entrepreneur, a little bit in peril, because they're not really sure how secure my $1 million commitment is to them. In my case, it's rock solid because I've already got the $75 million burning a hole in my pocket in a bank account somewhere.
And they get theirs back. Does it mature? And is their investment 3 years?
There is the investors.
The investors, sure.
Yeah, the investors in a venture capital fund generally, especially if it's a venture capital fund in California, because we all more or less do it the same way, are signing up for a 10-year journey. So they're putting their capital into the venture fund's bank account, but we can't find, in my case right now, I can't find 35 companies in a week. It takes me 34, maybe 4.5 years to find that many good companies. I don't want to just invest just to check a box. I got to be very, very, very picky. And we've gone months where we've invested in 2 or 3 companies in a month, and we've gone 60 days without investing in a single company. So they're signing up for me to find, in my case, just to use my math, my investors are signing up for me to find 30 or 40 companies in about 4 years. And we operate with a 2-check strategy. So we'll invest in the company when it's young. And what we really want to do is then when it gets a little bit older, it's typically going to go back out to the financial community again for a larger round of financing. So, as Bruce was saying, seed and Series A, the vocabulary is companies take in money really early from angels, typically like what might be called a pre-seed round. That's the really early round of companies. Angel investors, friends and family, your next door neighbor, wherever you can scrounge up the first few $100,000 that the company needs. We come in at what's called the seed stage or the Series A stage. And then depending on the company, depending on its capital requirements, it might need, then the alphabet just continues. Then there's a Series B, a Series C, a Series D. If it's Uber, you might raise a Series E, F, G. At some point, you even exceed the financial capabilities of the Silicon Valley, and then you're going to Wall Street because you need $300 million somehow to get to the next proverbial stage. That would be a biotech company or a company that has to spend a ton of money building a brand. So if you're Snapchat, if you're GoDaddy, if you're one of those companies that the technology is not that expensive, but you got to continue to run Super Bowl ads forever, you're going to need to continue to raise lots and lots of capital to fund a consumer advertising strategy. In healthcare, minus the hims and the hers and the things you see on football for a handful of drugs, prescription drugs. As we all know, most of healthcare is not consumer advertising, so we don't tend to invest in things where they need huge marketing war chests to invest in to get their company going. Any questions from the Zoom folks before I zoom forward?
So one thing as an angel investor, especially early on when I knew nothing, and now I know something more than nothing. I always thought VCs took more control, but it sounds like you don't. You're not in the 51%.
No.
Is that like more private equity that takes control and VCs
Yeah.
don't?
Yeah, let's define that a little bit. So, unfortunately, no one fixed this 50 years ago, but private equity sits up here, and then private equity sits underneath it along with venture capital. So it's all private equity because it's private. Venture capital are the folks like us that invest early and don't expect a controlling stake in the company. So we're investing in those companies when they're young. We're taking more risk. We're going to get a higher percentage of the company for a lower dollar amount, but we're not expecting 51% of the company, or even in a lot of cases, double-digit percent of the company. We're quite happy getting 2%, 3%, 10%. There's an occasional venture fund that's trying to get 15 or 20% of the company, but venture capital generally is not looking to control the startup. They're going to put some capital in. They might want the startup to form a board of directors, and they might want a seat on the board of directors. And yes, startups, once you take venture capital, you're typically going to be compelled to have a board, just like a big, large company would be. You'll have a 3-person board or a 5-person board. A couple of your board members will be investors. A couple of your board members will be the founders. You might have an independent on your board of your company. But our category of capital for startups is coming in with the expectation of being on either side of 10% of the company in terms of the ownership stake. When the company gets older and larger and private equity comes in, now they might need a larger influx, or maybe they want to sell to private equity. Those are usually multi-billion-dollar funds that are coming in to take at least a 51% stake in a company. But they've got to write a pretty big check to get that 51%. And a lot of times at that point, the founders are also selling to the private equity company some of their personal stock in the company. So it's a way for the founder to cash out, but probably still remain in the company. That's not uncommon either. It's a good opportunity to kind of plug, as you think about all of this. Certainly I didn't appreciate, the importance of that law firm. You get this advice a lot. Make sure you have a good law firm when you're doing a startup. When you start talking about the the rules of the road as the company gets bigger and bigger and bigger and not getting taken advantage of by your financial partners, the one place that you can get a really good advice is by getting a law firm working with you, even if it's a little uncomfortable, even if they charge you a little bit more. I always tell people, I'm not a lawyer and I don't have any equity at any law firm. So this is not I have just your interest in mind, have a good law firm, because you're going to get into these situations where you can't possibly know how the world works. If you're starting up a company, how things work when you're trying to decide if you should give up 8% of your company or 28% of your company for $5 million or for $250 million. But your law firm, if they specialize in working with startups, and if they specialize in working with healthcare startups, has hopefully seen hundreds of similar financing transactions, and they'll have some judgment that you won't have. And that's where their annoying hourly rate really comes in handy. I get this slide to advance. There it is. So really great team. Mentioned that if it weren't for having a cross-functional team, I don't think I'm satisfied with our venture fund. I think I'd always like to have more partners on the team. But I said many times, if I could only have 8 circles on the left-hand side of this slide, these are the right 8. We've got people that have clinical backgrounds. We have people that have run multi-billion-dollar health systems, including Cedars-Sinai here in town, including St. Joseph's, including one of the largest health systems in Ohio. It's a really good group, and obviously healthcare is pretty complicated, and you're not going to find anybody that knows everything about everything in healthcare. So having some specialists really helps our fund do its thing. The last point I wanted to make, yeah.
So I see on your website that your investors are also experts.
Yeah,
Generally.
that was the last thing I wanted to say, so thank you for that. This is unique, and I love talking about this because when I was fortunate enough to start this fund in 2017 with John Knackle, we knew one thing. Well, we knew 2 things. We wanted to start in Southern California because we thought, gee, it would be great if Southern California had one venture fund that knew about and cared about healthcare, and we really didn't have one back then. The other thing we knew is we were only going to do healthcare because John was at that time 40 years in the healthcare industry, and I knew enough about healthcare, and so we knew we were going to do healthcare. And this is where we kind of had a fork in the road. We need a bank account. Neither one of us are, wealthy people to where we could put $100 million of our own money into a bank account and basically privately invest. So we were going to need to round up investors. We rounded up 34 investors. But we had this thesis back then, and now it's so obvious, but at the time it seemed like we were being so clever. Instead of just going to anybody who wanted to invest in a venture fund, and most high net worth individuals invest into a venture fund, a lot of doctors and healthcare administrators invest in venture funds, a lot of healthcare companies invest in venture funds. We said to ourselves, well, it probably will give us a leg up if we specialize in finding investors out of the healthcare industry who might be interested in investing in our venture fund. So today we have 400 venture funds. Hopefully you guys are seeing people you recognize up here maybe. Because the whole point of this slide is we took money from a whole bunch of these logos, or we took money from the executives that ran those companies. It's not a requirement to be an investor in our fund, but today we have about 400 investors, and about 300 of them are healthcare industry people or healthcare industry companies. So that does 3 really great things for us. First thing it does is they know better than I, in a lot of cases, where these good startups are, right? City of Hope, there's startups inside the City of Hope. We may not even call them startups, but you guys know before we know when a company is onto something. So we have eyes and ears all over the country paying attention to the startups that are getting launched in the basement, in the garage, somewhere in their building. And when those companies are ready to quote unquote spin out of the hospital or the academic medical center or the garage, we get a call and we say, and somebody says, hey, I think you should take a look at this company. They're interested in financing. You probably haven't heard of them because they're just 4 people working in a machine shop somewhere, or 4 computer scientists working in some dark room to put together some cool AI technology. And I'm not going to always find them because these are hard to find companies. Right? These aren't companies that show up on any database. So these hundreds of men and women that are our investors help us find companies. The second thing they do is they help us diligence. We looked at a company a handful of years ago here in Southern California. You mentioned it, Carlson. That company produces a 3D printed spinal implant because, believe it or not, until they came around, when you did the back surgery, the spine surgeon walked in with a tackle box, opened you up, eyeballed your anatomy, digged around in the tackle box and looks for the part that's going to fit in your back, maybe the best. And that was as good as we had done for the first 30, 40 years of back surgery. Carlsmed comes around and says, maybe we could do a scan of your back. Maybe we could 3D print a mold that's exact to your anatomy, turn that into titanium, put that in a nice little plastic bag, send it to the doctor, and then the doctor's not fishing through his tackle box. The doctor is going to find it's going to open up the exact part that's going to fit in your back perfectly. And it turns out that back surgeries get redone an awful lot of time. They don't get redone because the surgeon did a bad job. They got redone because they put a wrong metal part into your spine. How are we going to evaluate that technology? We didn't have a spine surgeon on our team, but we did have a spine surgeon on our team. We had a few people in spine surgery that were investors in our fund, and we kind of considered them to be on our team. So we called these investors that we had. We said, could you take a look at this company that was getting off the ground in Carlsmed? Company's called they were getting off the ground in Carlsbad. Company is called Carlsmed. Take a look at them. They came back. Technology is rock solid, but more importantly, the people that they've hired are absolutely the thought leaders in spine surgery innovation. And they've already locked those people up. So they have great technology, but they also are going to have the ability to commercialize that technology. That gives us a great amount of confidence to invest in that company. We invested in them, to go back to your question, at about a $10 million valuation. We got a meaningful percentage of the company. About a minute later, they got their FDA approval, so they looked really smart, and now they're a multi-$100-million company. So we are able to use these 300 or 400 men and women for their subject matter expertise in healthcare that we couldn't possibly have everything covered. We've got 8 good people, but we need the brains and the experience and the expertise of a lot of these other 300. And then lastly, and by far the most important thing, and for any of you that have done anything entrepreneurial, you know, the common denominator challenge of every startup is oftentimes not getting the product built. That's actually maybe the easier part. You got this product and now you got to find a customer for it. And in this case, you have to find a healthcare customer for it. And healthcare customers are really hard. You're really hard to work with. Right? I can't just invent a new cup of coffee and go to City of Hope and say, do you want to take a chance on my technology? Healthcare organizations as a buyer are intrinsically risk adverse, and they have to be, right? Because you can't make mistakes. You make mistakes, people die. So the industry has to be risk adverse, which is not good news if you're an entrepreneur walking in saying, hey, take a chance on my company. Trust me, we can print a 3D printed spinal implant. We can put it in a plastic bag, and within 2 weeks, we can send it to the spine surgeon. They can open up and slip it into the person's back. It takes quite a big leap of faith for, it wouldn't be City of Hope, but for UCLA to take a chance of that. Got to find somebody who can do that. These men and women oftentimes are the champion for our companies, because we'll invest in a company that's got a particular product, technology, or service. It was almost inconceivable that I can't find somebody, and this slide doesn't do it justice. It's almost inconceivable that I can't run my finger down my list of investors and find a handful of people that our new investee couldn't talk to and hopefully gets the business going. Because these men and women are all over the healthcare system of America. They work in academic medical centers, they work in health systems, they work in standalone hospitals, they work on the post-acute side, like skilled nursing, like home health, assisted living. Some of them are in urgent care, some of them in surgery centers, some of them are work for the big insurance companies. And every one of our companies has a different way of making money, but pretty good bet I can help them. And again, that's where we really shine. I don't think our money is any greener than any other venture fund, but we're a lot more strategically helpful because we can help our, we brag about City of Hope, in full disclosure, is an investor in our fund. I brag about that all the time. And many entrepreneurs will want to take an investment from us because they know, oh, that's pretty cool. The City of Hope is an investor. I'm doing something in oncology. It's going to be helpful. You must know somebody at City of Hope. And when it comes time for getting some introductions, we're going to knock on your door. We're going to knock on Dr. Levine's door. We're going to knock on Robert Stone's door. We're going to knock on whoever is willing to take our call to introduce this little startup to City of Hope. We've done that probably 15 times over the last 6 years. Yeah.
So you're a wealthy doctor. It's like, gosh, I got this money. How do I invest in it? Can I just call you up and be like, hey, I've got all this money?
That's what happens every day. No, I wish that's what happened.
I'm like, yes, but you can invest anytime. It sounds like.
No, there's a period. We raised the cap. I oversimplified it, but when we raised for the first fund, it took us many months to aggregate that first 25 million.
How do you do that? Like, how does somebody who has all this money sitting there even know how do you know about them and how do they know about you?
I wish I knew. We market the fund to people that are known to invest in venture capital funds. A lot of doctors are our investors because they have found out about us because we are well known in one and only one thing, healthcare innovation.
So they might reach out to you today and then you say, okay, we'll be in touch with her.
Right. If they reach out today, I can take their capital because I happen to be finishing the $100 million fund. If they reach out to me in 6 months, I will say, would love to talk to you. Let's talk during the Summer Olympics in 2028 in Los Angeles, because next time will be 2028.
Okay.
So I happen to be open for business now, but generally I fundraise for about 6 to 9 months every 3 or 4 years.
And then what kind of return do you generate to your investors? Since it's kind of.
Yeah, they have to do really well because it's not as liquid as it would be in the stock market. You can invest in the Walt Disney Company today, and tomorrow you can change your mind and you can cash out of that stock. I have to be a lot better than the stock market, or else there's no sense in investing. You're not locked up for 10 years because as our companies have financial successes, we're sending you money throughout. You're not waiting for year 10 for a balloon payment. But it's still comparatively illiquid. So I have to do, our goal is to say, let's find out what the stock market did over those 10 years and what I hope will happen. Of course, it's up to VendorX and all the companies we invest into to have great financial performance. But I want to beat the stock market by 2 times, 3 times, 4 times. I want to kill the stock market. Otherwise, frankly, keep your money in the stock market. If you can get 9% of the stock market and I end up giving you on average 10%, an extra percentage point's not worth all the extra risk and illiquidity that you take with us. The average venture fund, if I'm a top performing fund, I'm going to be anywhere, depending on the decade, I'm going to be anywhere from 16 or 18% on the low end to 32, 35, 38% on the high end. And that's year over year interest. But it has to be that way because we're a riskier investment.
Got a question from one of our Zoomers.
Oh, good.
Larry, one of the things that you're doing a great talk with insights, and do you have a patient or consumer voice that you tap into for guidance or input?
A patient or consumer voice. well, we're all patients. But I think what Larry is talking about is there are companies that do have a strategy that is what you might call direct to consumer. They don't rely on selling their new innovation to City of Hope. They're bypassing the healthcare company or the insurance plan as their customer, and they're going right to you. We don't do a lot of that, but we do invest in some companies that sell directly to the patient, in which case they would call it a consumer mostly. Ready Set Food is a good example. Part of their strategy is taking ads out on Facebook for new moms, taking ads out on, doing advertising with Google so they can go directly to mom or dad and get them to come to their website, learn about this great powder that you can add to the baby formula or breast milk, read all the research, and then just like an e-commerce site, they can buy that product directly from the website or directly from Amazon. When we do direct to consumer, maybe the best way to answer Larry's question is we will typically try to find a venture fund that specializes in that, and we will co-invest with them. We say to them, you guys know everything about direct to consumer marketing, and we kind of don't, but we know everything about healthcare, and you kind of don't. So let's both spend a couple of months getting to know this company. And if you tell us it's a good investment from the marketing standpoint, we'll tell you if it's a good investment from the healthcare standpoint. If we both nod, then we might make an investment. So a lot of times we'll lean.
Further sense that just the patient experience part of healthcare as something to examine and look at, to evaluate.
100% we do that. We have a framework that is partially borrowed. See if I can get it up here. Partially borrowed. You'll have heard or you'll have seen a poster in your doctor's office or in your hospital that talks about the triple aim. That got popular a couple of decades ago. Some people expanded it to the quadruple aim. We look at it as a quintuple aim. I will not say that all 65 companies that we've invested in do all 5 of these things, but we want our companies to care and be doing something in at least one of them. And many of our companies do them from 2, 3, few of them do them are all 5. We want the company to, of course, result in better healthcare outcomes. We would like the company to help the financial performance of the healthcare providers that struggle. There's a lot of hospitals in America that are right at 0% profit margin. You don't know so much about this because if you just listen to what's on CNN, you think every healthcare organization in America is making money hand over fist. The aggregate profit margin for all the hospitals, for profit and non-profit in America, is usually dancing just on either side of 0%. So if we can help your primary care doctor's office, your dentist, your hospital make a little bit more money by saving costs, we think that's a good thing for the world. The thing that we've added and improved patient experience, to Larry's point, is something that we'll care a lot about. Of course, we're looking at companies that improve the experience of the patient, and we distinguish patient experience from better outcomes. Better outcomes is you are medically better off because of this medical device or this digital health company or whatever it is that we've invested in. Improved patient experience might be, it's just less crappy to be in the hospital thanks to this company. Lots of things would just make the consumer experience of being in the healthcare system of America better. Comedians talk about this, right? You go into a hospital and you fill out a form, and then you go down to the next room and you fill out a form, and it's the same exact information. Like, I just gave you that information. So things that improve the consumer experience are interesting to us. We actually spend a lot of time on the fifth thing is what we semi-invented, which is we'll invest in a lot of companies that make life better for the clinician. One of our more famous companies is a company called DeepScribe. Right, exactly. There are not a lot of doctors and nurses and allied healthcare professionals that I've ever met that said, you know, great, I went to nursing school, I went to doctor school, I did whatever education I did, and I'm spending my entire time tapping on the keyboard, writing these medical notes, all the stuff that the insurance industry needs now that we're a digital world. They're spending more time with their computer than they are their patients. What can we do to make life better for the clinicians? Make life better for the clinicians, life is better for the patients. So we spend a lot of time investing in companies that improve life for the men and women that deliver services to the healthcare industry. DeepScribe is a great example. It's not going to impress you what I'm about to say today, because we've just gone, 12 consecutive months, 15 consecutive months, depending on what you read, reading nothing but articles about artificial intelligence lately. But back in the day when we discovered DeepScribe, which came out of MIT, they would put a little, it was about the size of a small Amazon Echo Dot. They would put that in the doctor's room, and this technology would listen in to the conversation between the doctor and the patient. And it wouldn't transcribe the conversation, because we've had technology that does that for a long time. What it would do is listen in on the conversation and write the medical note the way the medical note needs to be written for the doctor. So now the doctor's not spending 12 minutes or 22 minutes with you, and then having to go to their computer and summarize all that. And they have to do it thoughtfully, because if it's not written up properly, the insurance company's not going to pay for it. This company's listening in, and it figures out how to synthesize the medical note such that it's appropriate for the patient care, and it has a better chance of getting paid for by the insurance company. And now that doctor is saving X minutes per appointment with the patient by not having to write the medical note. They still have to scan it. They still have to sign off on it and make sure that the artificial intelligence didn't say something wrong. I've got a gunshot wound on my left shoulder, but the artificial intelligence said the gunshot wound was on my right shoulder. They're going to spot check it, but it takes them 30 seconds to spot check the note, as opposed to spending several minutes to write the note. That technology squarely makes life better for the men and women that spend way more time inside their electronic medical record system than they would like to.
What about exits? Do you have any exits yet?
We have had exits. We didn't have exits. You should not have invited me. Yeah, right. We have. We've had small exits, some medium exits, some large exits. Our portfolio is, so the answer is yes. But we started investing in 2018. And that was an interesting, if now sort of map out where I've been, we got our first $25 million bank account. We started investing in companies. And just as our companies had some capital and they could start making a dent in the healthcare universe, which is what we want them to do, oh my gosh, the pandemic hits. The pandemic affects all the businesses. Many people in this room describe businesses they're in that have nothing to do with, it could be dog care, and everybody was affected by the pandemic. But if you're a healthcare startup, you're really affected by the pandemic. The world stops. The only thing that healthcare companies, the healthcare organizations care about is helping people survive this thing. We look back now and it all makes sense, but when you're in the middle of it, clinical trials stopped. So we had companies in our portfolio that were busy. We have a company in our portfolio that's changing for the real first innovation in the labor and delivery space since the invention of the epidural. We want that product to succeed. They were in the middle of helping women deliver babies better. I won't go into great detail on it. Also, I'm a man, so I shouldn't go into great detail on it. But they were doing clinical trials, and the FDA said, we need 240 people to go through this clinical trial. I need 120 of them to use the device, 120 of them to use a faux device that really didn't work. And I need to prove that muscle tear that goes on in the birth canal when the baby comes through the birth canal in moms goes down thanks to your device. So they're in the middle of a clinical trial. Pandemic hits, every clinical trial in America stops because that's not the priority when you're dealing with the pandemic. So we've had a lot of companies that got their butt kicked for 18 months. had to sort of get themselves cleaned up once the healthcare system started to open back up. And then they've gotten back on their feet and they're doing really well. The reason I say that is we have about 9 companies in our portfolio that are poised to start having those exits now that they've gotten themselves far enough away from the pandemic. The pandemic did not do us any favors now that we look back, given that we had, at that time, we had about 30 young healthcare startups that were just blindsided by this thing called the pandemic, which, you know, they couldn't possibly have prepared for, and we couldn't possibly have known it was coming. And only a couple of those companies had technology that was helping, that was designed to help the pandemic. The other 30 were just screwed for 18 months.
I just thought, to wrap it up, you had
Yeah.
the one company that's your favorite success story
Yeah, so
that you can share.
I will wrap up with the one favorite success story. Because it brings together a lot of different themes here. We invested in a company called Citizen. Citizen was founded by a gentleman named Anil Sethi. If a little bit overused, but if there's a godfather of healthcare data, it might be Anil Sethi. He started 5 or 6 companies before this one. One was the data system, the EMR used by Kaiser Permanente that went public. It was a product called Sequoia. One got bought by WebMD. One got bought by Citrix. One got bought by a little company called Apple and became Apple Health Records. One got bought by a little company called, well, I'll get to what they were called in a minute. We invested in company number 6. It goes back to our credentials. This gentleman had no problem raising capital. He wanted to raise $4 million to get his company out of the garage. He went to the Silicon Valley, and I don't know how many, what are called term sheets, but I don't know how many term sheets he got, but he got a lot of term sheets from a lot of different venture funds in the Silicon Valley, all wanting to put money into his company. Normally you think about that struggling entrepreneur and you assume they're going to work really hard and finally get one, you know, VendorX is finally going to get one venture fund to say yes. He had yeses all over the place because he had such the track record. He took, if the term Andreessen Horowitz means anything to this group, one of the more famous venture funds in the Silicon Valley, you know, one of those funds that started it all. Mr. Andreessen and Mr. Horowitz. He took the term sheet from them, and they were one of those investors that said, "You want $4 million? Here's $4 million." He took the piece of paper, he crossed out 4 million, and thankfully for us, he wrote in 3.8 million, and he scanned it, emailed it back to Andreessen Horowitz. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall because they then pick up this term sheet and they see that the 4 million has changed to 3.8 million, and they're probably a little bit offended because nobody turns down money from the gold standard of venture capital, and they deserve that reputation. They've been the best in the industry for decades. And Anil Sethi told Mr. Andreessen and Mr. Horowitz, it's the deal. You got to take $200,000 from these guys down in Pasadena. We were 5 minutes old, but it was known that we had these investors. It was known that we had this relationship with City of Hope. City of Hope was going to be very important in this company's story. So he said, you're either going to put 3.8 million into our company or you're not going to put any money into our company. So Andreessen Horowitz went along with it. We got to write a little check, but for us, it's a lot. We got to write a $200,000 check in it. We put more money in as it went. We put money in on a $16 million valuation. I think it was 23 months later, it sold for $550 million. That's the exercise that we go through. Now, they don't all work out. To go back to the point I made, my investors don't benefit to that entire tune because some of that profit that our fund made, many millions of dollars of profit, is actually going to go to pay for some of the things that didn't go well along that same way. But when the outcome is so magnificent, we're not buying a stock for $10 and being happy that we sold for $11. We're buying a share stock for $10 and hoping we can sell it for hundreds of dollars. You do that just 2 or 3 times, and you can pay for the companies that don't end up don't become successful, and still have some profit over to get the companies, to get our investors that 25, 30, 35% return on their investment that they're expecting.
Yeah, it's a very simple question. What's your minimum size of investment?
250,000, and you don't, despite the number of times I've said our investor, oh, the slide is gone, our investors give us 25 million, they actually don't. So just to be super clear, it would be super dumb for me to start a $25 million fund or a $100 million fund and say, give me $100 million. All that, most of that money would sit in the bank, earning nobody any interest. It doesn't do me any good, it doesn't do the investor any good. So the truth is, our $250,000 investor is really putting in about 50 a year for years 1 through 5. And then they're done. And then hopefully they start getting exits and they get the $250,000 out, but they are spreading it out over 5 years.
Okay, I have a question about control of investors versus founders that want to explore an imaginary situation. Suppose a founder comes to you, they look like they have a good product, good market. You put $1 million in. Another somebody else you bring along, they put $1 million in. You wait 3 years, 6 years. The product has worked kind of and has a reasonable margin, so the company doesn't go out of business. It's never going to be this unicorn rocket.
I'm never gonna get a $550 million acquisition in years. Right, okay.
No acquisition, can't go public. Do you, when you invested in that company, are there hooks in that you can force them later to sell or do something to liquidate you?
Almost never. I call it the tough conversation to have with my spouse, because I only get paid to babysit the companies for 10 years. That's the life of the fund. So in that case, the company's still around in year 11. I have to go explain to Angela why I'm still paying attention to a company and my investors aren't paying me to pay attention to that company anymore. But I do have a fiduciary responsibility, and unless somehow magically I owned 51% of the company, then I could control its destiny, but I never own anywhere near 51% of the company. So by and large, no. Now, we'll have lots of frank conversations with the investors. We might try to find somebody to acquire it and keep the investors on, or keep the founders on. There's a lot of different strategies, but it is the fleas with the dog situation. And a lot of companies will end up in that situation where after 10 years, they won't have died and they won't have done what Citizen done. They wouldn't have had a marvelous exit event. They're just on my books. That's a problem. I mean, it's my problem. It's not the investors have all had their exits at that point. If that company makes it or not, it's not going to change the financial performance. But I can't go to the founder and say, it's been 10 years, therefore you must sell no matter whether you want to or not. We don't have that kind of control.
So is that considered a loser, like for your investors?
No.
Like they think of it as nothing.
And keep it on the books, and then.
But I mean, so I was part of that, but in a scenario with John paid his 250 in 10 years, does he still, at year 11, have a little bit of that company that's just sort of?
Yeah, if we own 10% and John owned 10% of the fund, then John would own 1% of that company, and John would still get a monthly annual statement that said they're still on our books. But in reality, what we would do is we would try to just negotiate with the founders and just cash out at break even or a small profit or a small loss. But we would try to get it off our books, because at that point, if you look at it from the perspective of my investors, like, I've already gotten all the big wins out of my 32 companies. All the companies that were gonna pop have popped by then. So we're not counting on that company for any meaningful financial performance. But we would probably go to this make-believe company and say, we put in $250,000 10 years ago. Can you just give us $250,000 out of cash flow and get us off your balance sheet? And then I can distribute that $250,000 as a final payment to my investors.
Okay,
That probably is.
it's 8 o'clock. So
Oh, it is.
Wrap it up.
All right.
Unless there's just one more question.
Yeah, it's a kind of two-part question. One was in regards to the investment that you guys made, and that's all for it. If you have a is it that, one month we get 10%, or it's you?
No, that's my target percentage, yeah. That, the whole group might end up getting, the founders might be giving up 10%, 20%, 30% combined, but I'm getting distributed across 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 investors.
In regards to what
Yeah, that's like a 2-hour conversation. But it's the best if we started with what is the inside baseball, what if you're going to do a startup or are in a startup, that is what you should be asking. Well, what does a venture capital fund look for? The real inside baseball, we have a very elaborate, it's almost a scoring system. It's a framework of what we look for. The things you would expect are, does the company have a big market share? Except that in healthcare, you have to work really hard to develop a company that solves a problem in the healthcare industry of the United States, and it won't have a very big market share because everything's big in healthcare. It's a $4 trillion slice of our $20 trillion economy. It's a big chunk of the United States. So that doesn't help me very much. I think if I was an investor in other industries, I might obsess about whether the company's possible upside is big enough. Almost, I think we've not invested in fewer than 10 companies because we didn't think they had a big enough market size. Everything's big in healthcare. The thing that we pay a lot of attention to, if I could leave you with one inside baseball tip, is the phrase "we bet on the jockey more than the horse" is way overused. It basically means we pay as much or more attention to the founders than we do the thing that they're bringing to market. The thing that you're bringing to market will not work. Your business model will not work. You will fail. You will dust yourself off. You will try again. It will fail. You will iterate and iterate and iterate. That's just the nature of startups. Nobody gets it right the first time. You look at all the famous companies and you go back and look at their original business plans, they are nothing like what they originally came up with. So knowing that, you want to pick founders that are very resilient. You want to pick founders that have some ability to demonstrate to you that when the going gets tough, they're not going to fold up the startup and give up. They're going to keep going and they're going to persevere. So the characteristics of the founder or founders really matters to the evaluation of a venture fund. And I bet you if you put 20 VCs up here, 20 out of 20 say the same thing. You got to pay attention to the founder. And one of the things that you can do, because now I'm just talking about a beauty contest. I think that founder looks good. I don't think this founder looks good. But one of the things you can do is just make sure that your communication is great. I use the Bob Iger quote all the time. A great strategy really isn't that great if you don't have an ability to communicate it. And you're going to get 45 minutes with me to pitch your idea. Make sure you know how to communicate it, because you're going to have to communicate it to a lot more investors. And oh yeah, you're going to have to convince a whole bunch of people to work for your company and leave City of Hope with their nice salary and their benefits and do the insane thing of go working for a startup, which means you have to be a good people recruiter. So you need to be able to run your startup, you need to be able to fundraise, you need to be able to recruit talent, and you're never going to have enough money to pay what they're walking away from in their corporate job to come work for your startup. So you got to be charismatic, you got to be able to communicate your vision. So you really got to think. So I spent a lot of time emphasizing, have a good story, but be a good storyteller.
Okay, well, we'll let you.